with us now we have Florian, who is a senior researcher at Alliance to Feed the Earth in Disasters. And he's also writing a living literature review on societal collapse, and it's funded by Open Philanthropy. So thank you for coming.
All right, thank you very much, and I hope this talk is going to be interesting enough to keep you awake after a long day. Today I want to talk about famine, because famine is just a topic that comes often across in my work about the societal collapse, but also in my work for All-Fed. To get things going, I want to dig a bit in the history, because famine were just a very big thing in the past. But if we think about famines today, we often think about things like very localized events that we can solve by just shipping some food there. But this wasn't the thing in the past, where they were much bigger and even societally collapsing. And the thing is, they could be again big in the future. But in between, we have some kind of a gap, because when we look at this data here, this is from our World in data, and the bars are how many people died each decade from famines, while the red line is the world population. And as you can see, a lot of people died each year from famine, but this really dropped sharply in the 70s. Even though the world population was climbing and climbing. So obviously something happened. But before I'm going to reveal it, we're going to dive a bit more into the past. Because we can see in our historical records that many of the societal collapse in the past was associated with famine one way or the other. But in the last 100 years, this changed a lot. And one of the big reasons for this is that we now have global interconnected trade. So if there is a famine somewhere, we simply have the option to ship food there until there isn't a famine anymore, which you didn't have in the past, because transport of all kinds of things, for example food, was just extremely expensive to do. Also, our ability to produce food also just has increased by a lot. However, those 2 points don't mean that we can't have another famine in the future. You may have come across those 4 riders, the 4 riders of the apocalypse. And those are death, famine, war, and conquest. If you are wondering why war and conquest, I don't know, some medieval monks thought this would be the best way to classify them. But there's a reason why those 4 are always depicted together. Because very often, if you have a famine, then you have war and death. If you have war, then you have famine. And let's look at a few historical examples. First one is the potato famine in Europe, especially in Ireland. In Ireland, you lost half the population to death and emigration. But also, this famine disrupted the political systems all over Europe, and only a few years later, you had revolutions all across Europe. Next one is the famines in China around the 1850s. Those famines incited the so-called Taiping Rebellion, and in combination, this rebellion and the famine surrounding it caused over 60 million deaths. And finally, another example is the drought-induced famines that led to civil wars in the Mayan city-states, and also made it much easier for the Spanish to conquer them only a few decades later. And now I want to talk about why famine often happens so often, and also why it was so difficult to escape from it once it happened. In this picture, you can see like when you're having a famine, you usually have some kind of triggering event. This can be all kinds of things. It could be a war. It could be a climatic change, for example, caused by a supervolcano. But what these triggering events have in common usually, they lead to decreased crop production one way or the other. They lead to low population because people are dying. And they also lead to transportation problems, which influences your trade. And the problem is, if more people in your society die, well, then all kinds of things get disrupted, and you also have less food production, and you also have less trade. When you have less trade and less food production, you have famine, because you have less food available than people. And finally, where you have famine, you have death and health problems, and also like social cohesion starts to break down. Once you're at this point, you have a problem, because now you are in a self-reinforcing circle, and this circle will repeat until either you get food from outside, or the population is as low that the local carrying capacity can sustain it again. The local carrying capacity, which we might fall down to, would be something like hunter-gatherers or smallholder farmers, and obviously this would be a much, much lower population than we have right now. Another very interesting study I want to highlight is by Arvin et al. Classifying global catastrophic risk. Can really recommend to read it. What they did, they took all kinds of global catastrophic risks, and then they looked, okay, in what ways can those global catastrophic risks interact with society? And what they found again and again for things like asteroid impact, supervolcanoes, ecosystem collapse, nuclear war, and several others, they all lead to food system collapse. And the reason here is pretty simple, because food is very reliant on the status quo being stable. You need to have stable climate, because otherwise your crops won't grow. You need to have stable trade, because otherwise you can't deliver the food where it needs to be. You also need things like fertilizers and pesticides, which can also be easily disrupted in their production. All those things make the food system just like a very vulnerable system in general. Now that you know a bit about the background of famine, I want to talk about one event that could cause famine today. This is very recent research from us at Alfred. And what I want to talk about here is global catastrophic infrastructure loss, which I will explain in the following slides. But in general, this means that events that can disable our global industrial infrastructure. What can cause such events? So, in general, you can sort those events that can cause global catastrophic infrastructure failure into three groups. First, you have events that directly destroy the hardware, like if you have a high altitude electromagnetic pulse, like in the nuclear war, or if you have a solar storm that induces currents in electronics and destroys them. Then you have things where the software gets destroyed, like if you have a global coordinated cyber attack. And finally, you also can have extreme pandemics, where people simply stop showing up at their work. And our global infrastructure is very reliant on continuous maintenance. And if we stop doing the maintenance, it would break down over time. The effects this can have can be like direct. For example, the biggest effect would likely be for our power grid, because our power grid can be easily disrupted, and also we have those kinds of things, transformers. Those would be destroyed in many of those events. The problem is, if you want to have a new transformer, even now, you probably have to wait several months. You can imagine this would be way more difficult if you just had a continental or even global loss of electricity. It also has effects on other things, like, for example, the gas and oil industry. It could disrupt communication, it could disrupt transportation, and would likely even disable parts or maybe even all of our satellites. This is all really bad. But we also have indirect effects where all those things I just talked about, they can cause things like trade disruptions, and we just talked about how important trade is for our continuation of our food system. And also, it would likely disrupt our ability to produce fertilizers and pesticides. And fertilizers and pesticides are very important to keep producing the amount of food that we produce now. Now, let's look a bit more in detail into the study we did. We created a multiple regression model that tried to predict the amount of yield that is produced based on the amount of fertilizers, mechanization, irrigation, pesticides, and mechanization. And then we used this model to predict two scenarios. The first scenario is basically the first year after a global catastrophic infrastructure loss. We would instantly lose all the irrigation that is reliant on electrical pumps. Our mechanization would persist for now because we still have lots of gasoline lying around, so we could still run things like tractors. We wouldn't be able to produce fertilizers and pesticides anymore, but we also have stocks we could use. And finally, because we would have fewer animals, because we would cull them to use the food for humans, we would also have less manure available. Now, the second phase, or the second scenario, is where we look at everything that will happen after the first year. Then you also don't have mechanization anymore because you've run out of fuel, and you wouldn't have fertilizers and pesticides anymore because you couldn't produce new and your stocks are used up. Then what you can see here are the predictions of this model. So here we have the 4 crops we looked at: rice, soybean, corn, and wheat. This here is how much the yield gets reduced. And the colors just indicate the phase we're in, like yellow is phase 1 and orange is phase 2. As you can see, this is quite a massive drop. It differs by crop. So for example, soybean is relatively okay in the first phase, but the others have bigger problems. But in general, we can expect something like a 40 to 45 decrease in our yields in the second phase in those 4 crops together. I want to emphasize that this is a massive drop because to put things into perspective, in the time since the Industrial Revolution, we think that the biggest food shock that's happened globally was something like 10%, so 40% would be quite a lot more. And we can say that this would be an unprecedented event for our civilization. What you can see here is the spatial distribution of those results. The colors just indicate how much you get a decline. So if you have this deep blue, then you have a very big decline, 70% or more. Orange is like 35%, and yellow things are no decline. And this here is the second phase for maize. And what I want to emphasize here is how spatially different those results are. So for example, we have like Europe here and North America, where you have massive drops because, well, those are also the areas where we have the most intensive agriculture. And if you have very intensive agriculture and you lose your inputs, well, your yields are going to drop a lot. However, this is also like one catastrophe where Africa and also parts of Asia and India will be relatively fine because many of those areas have very low intensity agriculture now. And if you're not using much or any fertilizer at all, then obviously your yields don't drop if you don't have fertilizer anymore, because you didn't have fertilizer in the first place. Some take-home message from this very optimistic talk. Famines are not solved, but very much still a threat. Many of the catastrophes we have seen, like the global catastrophic risk, can lead to famine. Famines can be self-reinforcing once you're in them, and they will continue until you get back to the lowest population that your environment can sustain. Many of the global catastrophic global catastrophic infrastructure loss would be a very big problem for our society, because we would lose so many of our food production. But the good thing is we can prepare. I'm not going to talk about this a lot, because I only have a short talk, but I can recommend to you to engage with the work from Alfred. We have all kinds of research about this, and also many solutions which we could use in such a scenario and others. If you want to dig more into like societal collapse and what this might have to do with famine, I can recommend checking out my living literature review, and also just like talk about it, because many of the events that could cause food system disruptions are events that could very much happen in this century. But many of the countries worldwide aren't really prepared for that. What I can also really recommend, if you want to work more directly, you can write your thesis, for example, at Effective Thesis. They work in collaboration with Alfred, where you can directly do research on those things, like solutions for such events. We also take volunteers at Alfred. You can contact us. And finally, as we have funding constraint and many other organizations in this space, feel free to give us some money. This was my talk. I thank you, and I hope it was interesting. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. Great. Thank you for that talk. That was amazing. So if anyone wants me to ask questions, then submit them through Swapcard and just try to upvote the ones you like so we can talk about the most interesting questions first. So I first have a question that's a little bit less like directly with what you do, I guess, but do you know if there's any possibilities of like microloans or other financial tools to support smallholder farms and farmers?
Like for such events?
So more like in terms of like trying to eliminate famine as a cause, like is it possible to like support smaller farmers that are working without fertilizer to ensure that they are able to produce food?
Yeah, I think it would be a solution maybe for like localized events. If you like have, for example, a local hurricane or something, and if people are prepared better because they, for example, have bigger stocks of fertilizer because they had a loan and could buy some fertilizer, I think this could maybe help. But if you have such a global event, you usually run into the problem that you also need like a global solution.
I see. So not looking globally, like we want to get to know you, Florian. How prepared are you for such an event?
Okay-ish, I guess. My Fletcher, I have lots of food and also like things like fuel, like probably almost everyone here. I think I'm lacking a bit on the waterfront, but I also have like a river near me, so hopefully it won't be contaminated by fallout.
That's great. We hope you don't die in a famine. That would be horrible.
Thanks. Really appreciate it.
Just give us a hint, Florian. How can we prepare for a famine?
Like you personally,
Personally and more as a society, like both. We want to know everything.
Yeah, I think one thing that was also talked about here today was things like alternative proteins, I think, are very promising, like in general for solving problems with world hunger right now and also with environmental problems. But also in many of the catastrophic events that I have shown earlier, because they allow you to have a kind of isolated food production. Because if you have like a fermenter that is standing somewhere in, I don't know, bunker, for example, then this will be really resilient to all kinds of catastrophes. So I think alternative proteins are an overall nice solution for many problems.
So the impact of food waste, how big of a problem is it? And would it play a major role or even a role in catastrophic scenarios?
Yeah, I think we usually assume that you have like 13% food waste globally, I think. This would also probably a problem when it comes to any kind of famine situation, but way less so because, well, if people around you are starving, you have a pretty big incentive to make sure that nothing of your food spoils.
I'm not sure if this is your field of expertise, but if we had to switch off or destroy the internet to save us from AI, how many people would die? Would that be like an issue with people dying because we don't have internet?
Good question. Not exactly sure. It would definitely have a big impact. I think the map might turn out similarly as the one I've shown before, because like in Europe, we have this very highly mechanized agriculture, and also you have like, if you're using tractors now in Europe, usually they are connected with the internet because they need GPS and all those things working, and if you disrupt the internet, then you would likely lose many of the mechanization options in the industrialized world. So this would have a big effect. How big, I can't really tell.
Are there any specific research agendas you're most excited about?
Yeah. So I think one thing that comes across in our research at Allfed, but also in my work on societal collapse, is just like how important trade is in that situation, also like logistics in general. But the problem is that we have very little research in this direction. If people would do more research there, this would be very valuable, I think.
What do you think about personal security during famine?
Can you repeat?
Like, personal security during a famine, do you think that's an important factor to consider, or do you think it's less important when there's a famine?
It depends. I think if you want to save yourself, yeah, sure, having a personal bunker is nice. But if you want to save society from famine, then it probably won't help if some people have some extra protection. Because, like, as I said earlier, this is would be a very, very global problem, and therefore you also need like global solutions. But if you want to save yourself, yeah, you can buy a bunker.
Well, I think we're running out of time. If you want to like ask any specific like questions, then maybe Florian is up for it, or maybe he wants to go home and sleep like the rest of us. I'm feeling very exhausted after a long day, but thank you so much for your talk. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for the questions.